Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to a country that technically shouldn't exist. I'm serious. The Maldives is a nation of over 1,000 coral islands scattered across the Indian Ocean where the average ground level is 1.5 meters above sea level. The highest natural point in the entire country is 2.4 meters. For context, that's roughly the height of a refrigerator. Their entire civilization exists in the vertical space between your ankles and your shoulders, and they've been living there for over 2,000 years. It's genuinely wild. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and maybe grab a glass of water because we're about to spend the next few hours exploring the full sweep of Maldivian history and geography. If you're new here, welcome to the channel where we dive deep into countries around the world with enough detail to fill your brain while you drift off. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for being here. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Hit subscribe if you haven't already because we've got the whole alphabet to work through and you're not going to want to miss what's coming. Right then, let's start with the geography, because understanding where the Maldives actually is and what it looks like will make everything that follows make a lot more sense. Chapter 1. The Geography of Almost Nothing. Picture this. You're standing somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean, about 600 kilometers southwest of the southern tip of India. The water stretches in every direction to the horizon. It's that particular shade of blue that doesn't seem like it should exist in nature, the kind that makes you suspect someone's turned up the saturation on reality. And then, breaking the surface like someone scattered emeralds across a sapphire table, you see them. Islands. Hundreds of them. More than 1,000, actually. 1,190, if you're counting, which someone clearly was. These are the Maldives, and they are arranged in the most improbable way possible. Imagine taking a handful of pearl necklaces and dropping them into the ocean. That's essentially what you're looking at. 26 natural atolls strung out in a double chain running north to south for 820 kilometers. The whole formation is maybe 120 kilometers wide at its broadest point. From above, it looks like someone designed a country specifically to make mapmakers cry. Now here's the thing about atolls that makes them so visually striking. They're rings, circular or oval-shaped coral reefs with lagoons in the middle, often with small islands dotted around the reef like beads on a string. The Maldives has more atolls than any other country on Earth, and they come in every size, from massive formations 40 kilometers across to tiny rings barely 3 kilometers wide. Some atolls have 50 or 60 islands. Others have 3. The variety is frankly excessive. But let's zoom in on a single island for a second, because that's where things get really interesting, or really concerning depending on your relationship with the ocean. Your average Maldivian island is tiny. We're talking maybe 1 kilometer long and a few hundred meters wide. It's covered in palm trees, surrounded by a white sand beach, and ringed by a coral reef. Very postcard, very idyllic, and very, very flat. When I say flat, I mean aggressively flat. The Maldives has an average ground level of 1.5 meters above sea level. That makes it the lowest lying country on Earth. Not the lowest capital city, not the lowest inhabited place, the lowest entire country. If you're standing on a Maldivian island and you're taller than about 5 feet, congratulations, you're one of the highest points in the nation. The highest natural point in the entire archipelago is on an island called Vilingili, and it reaches the dizzying elevation of 2.4 meters above the waves. I cannot stress enough how absurd this is. That's about 8 feet. I've been in basement apartments with more vertical range, and yet, somehow, this has been enough. People have been living on these islands for millennia. They've built cities, mosques, governments, an entire functioning society, all while existing in the same vertical space as a particularly ambitious sandcastle. So how did these islands even form? Because coral doesn't just spontaneously decide to build a country. The answer involves volcanoes, which is not what you'd expect given that there are 0 volcanoes anywhere near the modern Maldives. But stick with me. Millions of years ago, there was a volcanic ridge here called the Chagos Laccadive Ridge. It ran underwater from India down toward the equator, and at some point in the distant past, volcanic activity along this ridge created a chain of volcanic islands poking above the ocean surface. Then the volcanoes went dormant, and here's where it gets good. As the volcanic islands began to slowly sink back into the ocean under their own weight, coral reefs started growing around their shores. Coral grows upward towards sunlight, and it grows fast enough that even as the volcanic base was sinking, the coral kept pace, building itself higher and higher. Eventually, the volcanic island disappeared completely beneath the waves, but the coral reef remained, forming a ring where the island's shoreline used to be. That ring is an atoll. The lagoon in the middle is where the old volcanic peak used to sit. Charles Darwin, of all people, figured this out. He proposed the theory of atoll formation during his voyage on the Beagle, and the Maldives is basically Exhibit A for his hypothesis, which means that every atoll you see here is essentially a coral tombstone marking where a volcano used to exist. Morbid, sure, but also kind of beautiful in a geological sense. The individual islands formed later, as coral debris, sand and organic material accumulated on the reef platforms. Over time, these deposits built up enough to poke above the high tide line. Seeds arrived, carried by ocean currents or birds. Plants took root. Slowly, improbably, you got islands. It's the kind of process that takes thousands of years and makes you realize that most of human civilization has happened on geological accidents. Now let's talk about what it's actually like to be there. The climate is tropical monsoon, which is a fancy way of saying it's hot and humid all year round with 2 distinct seasons based on which way the wind is blowing. From December to March, you get the dry northeast monsoon. Skies are clear, seas are calm, and the temperature hovers around 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. This is high season for tourism, which makes sense because it's essentially paradise weather. Then from May to October, the southwest monsoon arrives, bringing wind, rain, and generally choppier conditions. Rainfall during this period can be intense. We're talking 1,700 to 2,500 millimetres annually, most of it dumped across those few wet months. The humidity sits at a constant 75 to 85%, which means everything feels damp all the time. Your clothes, your sheets, your sense of optimism about ever feeling dry again. It's a lot. But here's the silver lining. Because the Maldives sit so close to the equator, it's almost never hit by cyclones. Tropical storms form north and south of here, but the Coriolis effect isn't strong enough at the equator to get them spinning. So while the weather can be wet and windy, it's rarely catastrophic. Small mercies. The ocean temperature stays remarkably consistent year-round, hovering between 27 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is perfect for coral, perfect for swimming, and perfect for the absolutely absurd diversity of marine life that calls these waters home. Over 2,000 species of fish, 200 species of coral, whale sharks cruising through like they own the place, which, to be fair, they kind of do. Manta rays, reef sharks, sea turtles, dolphins, and if you're lucky enough to be diving at night in certain areas, bioluminescent plankton that makes the water glow blue when you move through it. The underwater topography is genuinely dramatic. Between the atolls, the ocean floor drops away into channels that can reach depths of over 1,000 meters. You can be standing on a shallow reef in water up to your knees, and 50 meters away, the bottom just disappears into a blue void. These channels funnel strong currents between atolls, creating some of the best drift diving in the world and some of the most dangerous swimming conditions if you don't know what you're doing. Inside the atolls, the lagoons are shallower, calmer, and full of coral formations called thylas, which are basically underwater mountains that rise from the lagoon floor but don't quite break the surface. They're covered in coral and swarming with fish, and they're one of the main reasons divers lose their minds over this place. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the complete absence of elephants, mountains, rivers, or anything resembling topographical variety. The Maldives has no hills, no streams, no rivers, no lakes, no natural freshwater sources except rain. The soil is mostly coral sand and broken down organic matter, which is, let's be honest, pretty terrible for growing anything that isn't a coconut palm. For most of human history, if you lived here, you collected rainwater, ate a lot of fish, imported rice from somewhere else, and accepted that your entire existence was tied to the ocean in a way that would make most coastal communities look landlocked by comparison. The total land area of the Maldives is 298 square kilometers. That's smaller than Malta, smaller than the Isle of Wight. You could fit the entire country inside New York City with room to spare. But here's the kicker. 99% of the Maldives is water. Only 1% is land. It's less a country and more a very elaborate dot-to-dot puzzle scattered across 90,000 square kilometers of ocean. Of those 1,190 islands, only about 200 are inhabited. Another 80 or so are dedicated resort islands, each one typically occupied by a single luxury hotel and nothing else. The rest are uninhabited. Some are too small, some lack fresh water, some are just coconut-covered sandbars that disappear during high tide. It's a nation of overwhelming abundance and simultaneous scarcity, which is a very weird combination when you think about it. The capital, Malé, deserves its own paragraph because it's one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. The island of Malé is barely 5.8 square kilometers, and it's home to over 200,000 people. That's roughly the population density of Hong Kong or Monaco, except instead of skyscrapers and infrastructure built over centuries, you've got a flat coral island where every square meter has been paved, built on or otherwise claimed. There are no parks, no open spaces, just buildings crammed together so tightly that the streets feel like corridors. And it works somehow because humans are incredibly good at adapting to absurd circumstances. In recent decades, the Maldives has turned to land reclamation to create more space. The artificial island of Hulhu Malé was built starting in the late 1990s to ease overcrowding in Malé. They dredged sand from the ocean floor, piled it up, and created an entirely new island with an elevation of 2 meters above sea level. Which sounds great until you remember that 2 meters is still barely above the waterline and rising sea levels are very much a thing. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth that hangs over everything in the Maldives. Climate change isn't an abstract future threat here. It's an existential crisis happening in real time. Sea levels are rising, coral reefs are bleaching, storm surges are getting worse. And when your entire country exists in the vertical space between the ocean and a decent-sized wave, those things matter in a way that's hard to overstate. The Maldives is one of the most vulnerable nations on Earth to climate change, and there's no higher ground to retreat to because there is no higher ground. Period. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the present and future, we need to understand the past, because people have been living on these islands for over 2,000 years. building societies, navigating trade routes, converting to religions, resisting empires, and generally proving that you don't need mountains or rivers or any of the usual geographic advantages to create a functioning civilization. You just need fish, coconuts, an alarming tolerance for humidity, and the stubbornness to look at a flat coral island in the middle of nowhere and say, "Yeah, I can work with this." So now that you know where the Maldives is and what it looks like, let's talk about who showed up first and what they decided to do with 1,200 improbable islands scattered across the Indian Ocean. Chapter 2: Shells, Sailors, and the Buddha. So, you've got 1,200 coral islands scattered across the Indian Ocean, most of them barely above water, with no rivers, no metal, no suitable land for farming anything except coconuts, and no obvious reason why anyone would voluntarily choose to live there permanently. And yet, by around 1,500 years before the Common Era, someone looked at this situation and thought, yes, this will do nicely. We don't know exactly who these first settlers were. The archaeological record is frustratingly sparse, partly because coral islands aren't great at preserving ancient organic materials, and partly because most of what was built in the early period got recycled, destroyed, or swallowed by the ocean. But we can make some educated guesses based on what survived and what the oral traditions tell us. The earliest inhabitants were probably seafaring peoples from the Indian subcontinent, most likely from southern India or Sri Lanka. These weren't people who accidentally drifted onto the islands and decided to stay. This was deliberate settlement by experienced mariners who understood monsoon wind patterns and knew how to navigate open ocean. You don't end up on a coral atoll 600 kilometers from the nearest mainland unless you know exactly what you're doing. Maldivian oral tradition mentions a people called the Reedin, who supposedly inhabited the islands before anyone else. Were they a distinct ethnic group? Earlier settlers from somewhere else? A mythologized memory of pre-Buddhist inhabitants? Honestly, we don't know. What we do know is that by the time written records appear much later, the dominant cultural and linguistic influences in the Maldives are clearly Dravidian, suggesting strong connections to southern India and Sri Lanka that go back millennia. Now, here's what makes early Maldivian settlement particularly interesting. Most ancient civilizations built themselves around rivers. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt had the Nile. China had the Yellow River. Rivers gave you fresh water, fertile soil, transportation, and a convenient way to get rid of your waste. The Maldives had none of that. What they had was fish, coconuts, and an absolutely absurd abundance of cowrie shells. And this is where things get genuinely wild. Cowrie shells, specifically the money cowrie species that grows in shallow tropical waters, became one of the most important trade commodities in the ancient world. These small, shiny shells were used as currency across vast stretches of Africa and Asia for over 2,000 years, and the Maldives was one of the primary sources. Arab traders called the islands Dibajat, which roughly translates to the Money Islands. Chinese records refer to the Kingdom of the Cowrie Shells. This was basically the Maldivian equivalent of striking oil, except the oil was tiny marine snails and the drilling operation involved wading into lagoons and picking them up. The cowrie trade made the Maldives unexpectedly wealthy and strategically important. Merchants from Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China would stop at the islands specifically to load up on shells. The shells would then be transported to ports across the Indian Ocean, carried overland along trade routes, and end up as currency in markets from Bengal to West Africa. It's a completely bizarre economic system when you think about it, but it worked for centuries. The Maldives was exporting money, which is a pretty good business model if you can pull it off. But shells weren't the only export. The islands also produced coir rope, made from coconut fibre, which was prized by sailors because it doesn't rot in salt water the way hemp rope does. If you were an Arab trader navigating the Indian Ocean in a wooden dhow, you wanted Maldivian coir rope holding your ship together. They also exported dried fish, ambergris when they could find it, and later on, woven mats and textiles made from coconut palm fibre. None of these are particularly glamorous products, but they kept the trade flowing. In return, the Maldives imported basically everything they couldn't grow on a coral island. Rice, which became a staple despite being completely impossible to cultivate locally. Textiles. Metal goods, since there's no ore on a coral atoll. Spices. Pottery. Luxury items for the ruling class. The economy was entirely dependent on maritime trade, which meant that knowing how to sail and understanding monsoon patterns wasn't just useful, it was existential. Now let's talk about religion, because this is where things get complicated. By around the 3rd century BCE, Buddhism had reached the Maldives, almost certainly from Sri Lanka, and it stuck. For over 1,000 years, the Maldives was a Buddhist society, with monasteries, stupas, and a whole religious infrastructure that's mostly been erased from the physical landscape but still shows up in archaeological digs if you know where to look. The evidence for this Buddhist period comes from a few sources. First, there are the Maumoon copper plates, which are the oldest surviving written records from the Maldives. They're written in an early form of Daivhai, the local language, and they reference the Buddhist era even though they were inscribed in the 12th century, right around the time everything was about to change. Second, there are archaeological sites scattered across various atolls, Gan, Istu and others, where you can still find the ruins of Buddhist structures, coral stone stupas, monastery foundations, occasional carved Buddha images that somehow survived the iconoclasm that came later. The Buddhist period also brought Sanskrit influence into the language and culture. Early Dihaivi script shows clear Sanskrit roots, and many place names and religious terms have Sanskrit origins. There's also evidence of Hindu influences mixed in with the Buddhism, which isn't surprising given that the two religions often coexisted in South Asia, and people weren't always purists about keeping them separate. What's particularly interesting is that the Maldivian version of Buddhism seems to have had some unusual features. There are suggestions of sun worship traditions that may have predated Buddhism or gotten folded into it, and women in Maldivian society had a level of autonomy and property rights that was pretty unusual for the time. Queens could rule in their own right, not just as regents. Inheritance had matrilineal elements. This might have been influenced by Buddhism's relatively progressive stance on women for the era, or it might reflect even older traditions from the pre-Buddhist period. Either way, it made the Maldives a bit of an outlier in the region. Politically, the early period was messy. The islands started out as separate kingdoms or chiefdoms, each atoll or group of atolls controlling its own affairs. Gradually, over centuries, these got consolidated under a single ruler. The title used by these early kings was Maharadun, which translates roughly to Great King. The capital moved around between different atolls before eventually settling in Malé, probably because Malé was centrally located and had a decent natural harbour by Coral Atoll standards. The consolidation process wasn't smooth. You had rival factions, succession disputes, and the usual power struggles that come with trying to unite a bunch of islands spread across 800 kilometres of ocean. But by the 12th century, the Maldives was functioning as a reasonably centralised Buddhist kingdom, with a single monarch, a court, a bureaucracy of sorts, and a trade network that connected them to most of maritime Asia. Daily life during this period would have been surprisingly stable for most people. assuming you survived childhood and didn't get caught in a cyclone. Your average Maldivian was probably a fisherman or involved in some aspect of the coconut industry. You lived in a house made from coral, stone and palm thatch. You ate fish, rice if you could afford it, and various preparations involving coconut. You collected rainwater in cisterns. You participated in Buddhist rituals and festivals. You paid tribute to the king, assuming his tax collectors made it out to your island. And you spent a lot of time in boats because everything in the Maldives involves boats. Inter-island communication and trade were constant. You couldn't be self-sufficient on a single coral island, so you needed to interact with neighbouring islands to trade goods, arrange marriages, share resources, and occasionally settle disputes. This created a maritime culture where everyone learned to sail basically as soon as they could walk. Traditional Maldivian boats, called donis, were built from coconut timber and designed specifically for navigating lagoons, reefs, and open ocean. They're still in use today, which tells you something about the design. The islands also benefited enormously from their location on the monsoon trade routes. If you were sailing from Arabia to Southeast Asia, or from India to East Africa, the Maldives was right there along the way. Ships would stop for fresh water, repairs, provisions, and of course to trade. This meant that even though the Maldives was geographically isolated, it wasn't culturally isolated. Ideas, technologies, religions, and people flowed through constantly. The Maldives was essentially a maritime crossroads, which for a nation of tiny coral islands is about the best strategic position you could hope for. Think about what this meant practically. A merchant ship from Oman would arrive carrying dates, frankincense, and metalwork. A vessel from the Malabar coast would bring spices and textiles. Chinese junks occasionally showed up with porcelain and silk. Each one brought news from distant ports, stories from other lands, and exposure to different ways of thinking. For the Maldivians, this constant contact meant they were never really provincial despite living on isolated coral islands. They knew what was happening in Calicut, in Basra, in Malacca. They understood the politics of the Indian Ocean world because the Indian Ocean world kept washing up on their beaches. Arab traders were particularly frequent visitors during this period. They'd been sailing the Indian Ocean for centuries, and they knew the Maldives well. They called the islands Dibajat and wrote about them in their travel accounts. They bought cowrie shells by the shipload, and they brought with them not just trade goods but also ideas, stories, and a religion that would eventually transform the islands completely. But we're not there yet. For now, in the centuries leading up to the 12th century, the Maldives was a functioning Buddhist kingdom, quietly prosperous, strategically positioned, and largely left alone by the major empires of the region. Sri Lanka had its own problems. The Indian subcontinent was fragmented. The great Southeast Asian empires were focused elsewhere. Nobody was particularly interested in conquering 1,200 coral islands with no resources except fish and shells, which honestly was probably fine with the Maldivians. They had trade, they had religion, they had a political system that mostly worked. They had enough rice imported from abroad and enough fish in the lagoons to keep everyone fed. Life was humid, occasionally precarious, and entirely dependent on the ocean, but it was stable, predictable, even. And then, in 1153, everything changed, because in that year, according to tradition, the entire country converted to Islam in what has to be one of the fastest and most complete religious transformations in history. The Buddhist temples got torn down or converted into mosques. The stupas were dismantled. The old gods were abandoned, and the call to prayer started echoing across the lagoons 5 times a day. But we'll get to that story in a moment. Because the conversion to Islam isn't just a footnote in Maldivian history, it's the hinge on which everything else turns. It reshaped the culture, the politics, the architecture, the law, and the identity of the islands in ways that are still visible today, nearly 900 years later. So let's pause here. At the end of the Buddhist period, with the Maldives quietly going about its business as a prosperous maritime trading kingdom, the temples are still standing, the monks are still chanting, the cowrie shells are still being exported by the ton, and somewhere out there on the Indian Ocean, sailing closer with every monsoon wind, is the force that's about to remake everything. Chapter 3. How to convert a kingdom in one night, allegedly. Right. So it's 1153, and the Maldives is about to experience one of the fastest and most complete religious transformations in recorded history. The official story, the one that's been passed down for nearly 9 centuries and is still taught in Maldivian schools, involves a demon, a virgin sacrifice, and a very brave Moroccan scholar with excellent recitation skills. Is it historically accurate? Almost certainly not. Is it a great story? Absolutely. Let's start there. According to tradition, there was a sea demon called a Ranamari that would emerge from the ocean once a month and terrorize the capital. The only way to appease this demon was to sacrifice a virgin girl. You'd leave her in a temple overnight, the demon would appear, do whatever demons do, and by morning the girl would be dead and the demon would be satisfied for another month. This had apparently been going on for a while, and unsurprisingly, people were not thrilled about it. Enter Abu al-Barakat Yusuf al-Barbari, a Moroccan Islamic scholar who happened to be visiting the islands. The story goes that he heard about the demon situation and volunteered to spend the night in the temple in place of the next scheduled victim. The king agreed, probably figuring that losing a foreign scholar was preferable to losing another local girl. So Abu al-Barakat went into the temple, and instead of waiting to be attacked by a sea monster, he spent the entire night reciting verses from the Quran. Morning came. Abu al-Barakat walked out alive. The demon never appeared. The king, deeply impressed and presumably relieved, converted to Islam on the spot. The entire population followed his lead. The Buddhist temples were abandoned, and within a remarkably short period, the Maldives had become an Islamic sultanate. The end. Now, here's what probably actually happened. The Maldives had been receiving Muslim traders for centuries. Arab and Persian merchants had been stopping at the islands since at least the 9th or 10th century, and they'd been bringing not just goods but also ideas, stories and religious teachings. By the 12th century, there was almost certainly a small Muslim community already present in Malé, probably clustered around the port. Some Maldivians had likely converted already, either through marriage, trade relationships, or genuine religious conviction. The Buddhist king who became Sultan Muhammad al-Adil after his conversion was facing a strategic decision. The Islamic world was expanding its maritime trade networks across the Indian Ocean. Major ports from Aden to Calicut to Malacca were either Muslim-ruled or had significant Muslim merchant communities. If you wanted to participate fully in this trade system, if you wanted preferential treatment in ports and access to the most lucrative networks, converting to Islam made excellent political and economic sense. So it's entirely plausible that the king decided to convert for pragmatic reasons and used the demon story as a convenient narrative to justify the decision to his subjects. A miracle happened. We're all Muslims now. Please destroy your ancestral temples is a much easier sell than I did a cost-benefit analysis of regional trade patterns and decided we should switch religions. The demon story gave the conversion divine legitimacy and made it feel like destiny rather than policy. Whatever the actual mechanism, the conversion happened, and it was thorough. Buddhist temples were torn down or converted into mosques. Statues of the Buddha were destroyed or buried. The old religious texts were discarded. Within a generation or two, Buddhism had been almost completely erased from the Maldivian cultural landscape. A few archaeological remnants survived, hidden or forgotten, but the living Buddhist tradition was gone. The political structure changed too. The title Maharadun was replaced with Sultan. Sharia law was implemented as the legal framework, though it was adapted to local customs in ways that would have made orthodox Islamic scholars in Baghdad raise their eyebrows. Arabic script was adopted for religious texts, though Daivehai continued to be written in its own script for everyday use. Islamic scholars, often brought in from abroad, became influential advisors to the Sultan. And here's something genuinely remarkable about the Maldivian Sultanate. Women could rule, not as regents holding power temporarily for an underage son, as sultanas in their own right. Over the course of the Sultanate period, several women held the throne, and they weren't anomalies or exceptions. They were part of the normal succession pattern. This was incredibly unusual in the Islamic world at the time, where women rulers were rare and often controversial. But the Maldives had strong matrilineal traditions from the pre-Islamic period, and apparently converting to Islam didn't mean abandoning that aspect of their culture. The most famous of these female rulers was Rehendi Khadija, who ruled in the 14th century, and by all accounts was a competent administrator who managed to keep the various atoll chiefs in line and the trade flowing smoothly. The fact that she could do this while also being a woman in a supposedly patriarchal Islamic sultanate tells you something about how the Maldives adapted Islam to fit its existing social structures rather than the other way around. Between 1153 and 1558, the Maldives cycled through 6 different dynasties and 84 sultans. Some of those reigns lasted decades, others lasted weeks. The succession system was complicated, occasionally violent, and involved a lot of palace intrigue, poisonings, coups, and strategic marriages. But through all the chaos, the basic structure remained stable. The Sultanate controlled the atolls, trade continued, Islam became deeply embedded in the culture, and the Maldives maintained its independence. The cowrie shell trade continued to flourish under Islamic rule. If anything, it expanded, because the Maldives was now fully integrated into the Islamic maritime trading network that stretched from Morocco to Indonesia. Maldivian coir rope remained in high demand, and a new export started gaining prominence: dried fish, specifically dried tuna, which became known as Maldive fish and was exported across the region as a flavouring agent and protein source. Architecturally, the Islamic period produced some genuinely beautiful work. Mosques were built from coral stone, which is exactly what it sounds like. Limestone formed from dead coral, cut into blocks and carved with intricate geometric patterns and Arabic calligraphy. The craftsmanship was exceptional, and some of these early mosques still survive today, weathered but intact, which is impressive given that coral stone and salt water are not natural friends. Life for most Maldivians didn't change dramatically after the conversion. You still fished, you still collected rainwater, you still lived in a house made from coral and palm timber on a flat island surrounded by ocean. But now you prayed 5 times a day facing Mecca, you observed Ramadan, you followed Islamic dietary laws, and your social life revolved around the mosque instead of the temple. The rhythm of life was different, but the fundamental challenges getting enough fresh water, surviving storms, dealing with the heat remained exactly the same. For 400 years this system worked. The Maldives was a small but stable Islamic sultanate, strategically positioned on the trade routes, wealthy enough from exports to import what it needed, and far enough from major empires to avoid getting conquered. It was, by the standards of small maritime states, a pretty good run. And then the Portuguese showed up. The Portuguese had been expanding aggressively across the Indian Ocean since the early 1500s. They'd captured Goa in 1510, Malacca in 1511, and established a strong presence in Sri Lanka. Their strategy was to control the major ports and sea routes, monopolize the spice trade, and convert everyone to Catholicism while they were at it. They were exceptionally good at naval warfare, and exceptionally bad at understanding why local populations might not appreciate being invaded and forcibly converted. In 1558, a Portuguese captain named Andreas André decided to invade the Maldives. He sailed into Malay with a small fleet, killed Sultan Ali VI, installed a Portuguese garrison, and declared the islands under Portuguese control. Then he and his fellow officers settled in to enjoy their new conquest while also attempting to convert the Muslim population to Catholicism and extracting as much wealth as possible through taxation. This went about as well as you'd expect. The Maldivians were not interested in becoming Catholic. They were not interested in paying tribute to Portugal, and they were definitely not interested in having foreign soldiers occupying their capital and destroying their mosques to build churches. The occupation lasted 15 years, and every single one of those years was marked by resistance, resentment, and mounting rage. The Portuguese controlled Malay, but they never controlled the outer atolls. They couldn't. The archipelago was too spread out, the islands too numerous, and their garrison too small. So while they held the capital and could project power in the immediate vicinity, most of the Maldives remained effectively autonomous, and in those outer atolls, a resistance movement was quietly organizing. The leader of this movement was a man named Muhammad Thakurufaanu, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated figures in Maldivian history. Thakurufaanu and his two brothers Ali and Hassan operated from an island far from Malay and began a guerrilla campaign against the Portuguese occupation. They used a small, fast boat called an oddy to sail between atolls under cover of darkness, raiding Portuguese positions, gathering weapons and supplies, and building a network of supporters across the archipelago. It was low-intensity warfare, the kind that's incredibly difficult to defend against when you're an occupying force spread thin across 1,000 islands. The Portuguese couldn't be everywhere at once. Thakurufaanu could strike and disappear into the maze of atolls before reinforcements arrived. Over the course of several years, he turned this into a systematic campaign, weakening the Portuguese hold and demonstrating that resistance was possible. In 1573, Thakurufaanu made his move. He and his forces sailed to Malé under cover of night, infiltrated the capital, and launched a coordinated assault on the Portuguese garrison. The fighting was brutal and brief. By morning, the Portuguese commander and most of his soldiers were dead. The survivors fled or surrendered. After 15 years of occupation, the Maldives was free again. Thakurufaanu was proclaimed Sultan, and he's remained a national hero ever since. There are statues of him, streets named after him. The boat he supposedly used for his guerrilla raids is a national symbol. He represents resistance, independence, and the refusal to be conquered, which are themes that resonate pretty deeply in a small island nation that has spent most of its history trying to avoid being swallowed by larger powers. After the Portuguese were expelled, the Maldives went back to being an independent Islamic sultanate, but with a much stronger emphasis on maintaining that independence. The experience of occupation had been traumatic. Mosques had been destroyed, people had been killed or forced to convert. The cultural and religious integrity of the nation had been threatened in a way it never had been before. So the post-Portuguese Sultanate was more defensive, more insular, and much more committed to keeping European powers at arm's length. The Portuguese never came back. Whether they decided the Maldives wasn't worth the trouble or they were too busy with other colonial projects elsewhere, they left the islands alone. And for the next few centuries, the Maldives managed to maintain its independence through a combination of geographic isolation, strategic irrelevance to major powers, and sheer stubborn determination not to be conquered again. The Sultanate continued, with all its dynastic drama and succession disputes. Trade continued. Islam remained the foundation of society. And life on the Coral Islands went on much as it had for centuries, with one crucial difference. The Maldivians now knew exactly what could happen if they let their guard down. They'd been conquered once. They weren't going to let it happen again. Or so they thought. Because while the Portuguese were gone, the age of European colonialism was just getting started. And eventually, another empire would come calling. One that was bigger, more powerful, and far more patient than the Portuguese had ever been. Chapter 4. The Empire That Couldn't Be Bothered. So the bigger, more powerful, more patient empire that came calling was, predictably, the British. But here's where the Maldives got unexpectedly lucky. Because the British Empire's approach to the Maldives was essentially, sure, you can be ours, but honestly we can't be bothered to actually govern you. Just don't let anyone else have you and we're good. Let me explain. In 1796, the British captured Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, from the Dutch. Ceylon had historically claimed some degree of authority over the Maldives, mostly in the form of an annual tribute payment that the Maldivian sultans sent to acknowledge Ceylon's regional dominance. It was a pretty standard arrangement in the pre-colonial Indian Ocean world. Small maritime state pays tribute to bigger regional power. Bigger regional power leaves small state alone to manage its own affairs. When the British took over Ceylon, they inherited this relationship with the Maldives. The sultans kept sending tribute, now to the British administration in Colombo instead of to a Ceylonese king. And the British basically shrugged and said fine. They had no particular interest in actively colonizing the Maldives. There were no resources to extract, no land suitable for plantations, no strategic port that couldn't be better served by facilities in Ceylon. Just 1,200 tiny coral islands with nothing on them except fish, coconuts, and a population that had proven fairly adept at resisting foreign occupation. This arrangement continued for nearly a century with minimal drama. The sultans ruled the Maldives, the British ruled Ceylon and handled Maldivian foreign affairs from a distance. Most Maldivians probably had no idea they were technically under British protection, because it made almost no practical difference to their daily lives. There were no British troops stationed in Malé, no British administrators, no British missionaries trying to convert anyone. It was imperialism in the most abstract, hands-off sense possible. In 1887, the relationship was formalised with a protectorate agreement. The Maldives became an official British protectorate, which meant that Britain controlled Maldivian foreign policy and defence, while the Sultan retained complete authority over internal matters. On paper, this looked like typical colonial arrangement. In practice, it meant the Sultan kept doing exactly what he'd been doing, and the British kept doing exactly what they'd been doing, which was very little. This is genuinely unusual in the context of the British Empire. The British were generally much more enthusiastic about colonialism than this. They loved installing administrators, building infrastructure, reorganising legal systems, extracting resources, and generally making their presence extremely obvious and often extremely unwelcome. But the Maldives got the imperial equivalent of a shrug. Britain's main interest was strategic denial. making sure no other European power could use the islands as a naval base. As long as that box was checked, they were content to let the Sultanate handle everything else. So life in the Maldives during the British period continued much as it had before. You fished, you collected rainwater, you prayed at the mosque, you paid taxes to the Sultan, you participated in the same trade networks, followed the same laws, spoke the same language, practiced the same religion. The British protectorate was a legal abstraction that existed mainly in documents filed in London and Colombo. For the average Maldivian living on an outer atoll, the biggest foreign power in their life was probably still the merchant ships that occasionally stopped by to trade. The economic structure remained largely traditional. Cowrie shells had declined in importance as currency by this point. Other forms of money had largely replaced them in global trade. But dried fish exports had expanded significantly. Maldivian dried tuna, processed using traditional methods and shipped across the region, became a major export commodity. The process of making it hadn't changed much in centuries. You'd catch the tuna, gut and clean it, boil it, smoke it over a wood fire, then dry it in the sun until it was hard as a rock and could survive months of transport without spoiling. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was reliable income. Coir rope continued to sell well. The coconut palms that covered most inhabited islands provided a steady supply of husks, which could be soaked, beaten, and woven into rope that was prized by sailors across the Indian Ocean. And the Maldives remained a small but stable player in the Indian Ocean trading world, just as it had been for centuries. The British period didn't transform the economy so much as freeze it in place. There was no industrial development, no mechanization, no significant foreign investment. The Maldives in 1960 was economically not that different from the Maldives in 1760. Then World War II happened, and suddenly the British remembered the Maldives existed. During the war, the British needed staging posts and refueling points across the Indian Ocean for their aircraft, and it turned out that Gan, an island in one of the southern atolls, was geographically useful for this purpose. So the British established a small military presence there, built an airfield, and used it as an RAF staging post. For most of the war, this was pretty low-key. The base was staffed by British personnel. The local population in the southern atolls saw some economic benefits from the military presence, and the Sultan in Malay didn't object because technically the British had the right to do this under the Protectorate Agreement. But after the war ended, the British decided they wanted to keep the base at Gan permanently. This created a problem because the Maldivian government was starting to have opinions about things like permanent foreign military bases on their territory. The post-war world was experiencing a wave of decolonization. India had gained independence in 1947. Ceylon got independence in 1948. All across Asia and Africa, colonial territories were pushing for self-rule. The idea that the Maldives would just accept a permanent British base without negotiation seemed increasingly outdated. The dispute over Gan escalated in the late 1950s and created one of the stranger episodes in Maldivian history. The southern atolls, which benefited economically from the British base and were geographically distant from Malay, declared independence from the Maldives in 1959 and formed the United Suvadev Republic. They were led by a man named Abdullah Afif, who argued that the Malay government didn't represent southern interests and that the southern atolls should be autonomous. The British, who very much wanted to keep their airbase, quietly supported the Suvadev secession. This put them in the awkward position of backing a separatist movement against the government of their own protectorate, which is the kind of logical pretzel that imperial powers occasionally twisted themselves into when strategic interests conflicted with their supposed principles. The Suvadev Republic lasted until 1963. when the Maldivian government negotiated its reintegration. Afif eventually fled to the Seychelles. The British base remained operational for a while longer under a negotiated agreement, and the southern atolls rejoined the rest of the country. It was a messy situation that highlighted the tensions between centralised authority in Malé and the geographic reality of an archipelago where outlying atolls could feel very disconnected from the capital. By the early 1960s, independence was clearly on the horizon. The global tide of decolonisation was unstoppable. The British Empire was rapidly dismantling itself. And the Maldives, which had never been heavily colonised in the first place, was in a good position to transition to full independence without the violent struggles that marked decolonisation in many other places. Negotiations began, and they went surprisingly smoothly. The British had minimal economic investment in the Maldives to protect. There was no significant British settler population to complicate things. The strategic value of the islands was declining as military technology evolved. Britain was happy to let the Maldives go, and the Maldivian leadership was eager to formalise their independence. On July 26, 1965, the Maldives became fully independent. The protectorate agreement was terminated. The Maldives joined the Commonwealth as an independent nation. And after nearly 80 years of British protection that had mostly consisted of Britain not doing very much, the country was finally, officially, in control of its own affairs again. At independence, the Maldives was still a sultanate. Sultan Muhammad Farid Didi, who had ruled since 1954, remained head of state. But the political system was evolving. A constitution had actually been introduced back in 1932, making the Maldives one of the first Asian countries to adopt constitutional governance. By the time of independence, there was a Prime Minister, Ibrahim Nasir, who wielded significant power, and the traditional absolute authority of the Sultan had been constrained by law. The country faced significant challenges. The economy was still heavily dependent on fishing and whatever trade goods could be scraped together from coconuts and coral. There was minimal infrastructure. Education was limited, most islands had no schools, and literacy rates were low outside of Malé. Healthcare was basic at best. If you got seriously ill on an outer atoll, your options were traditional medicine, prayer, or dying, because there were no hospitals and no way to reach one in time, even if there had been. Most islands had no electricity, no running water beyond what could be collected from rain, and no connection to the outside world except by boat. The Maldives was independent, but it was also extremely poor and extremely isolated. The population was small, maybe 100,000 people scattered across 200 inhabited islands. Communication between islands was slow and dependent entirely on weather conditions. If the monsoon winds were blowing the wrong way, you could be stuck on your home island for weeks waiting for safe sailing conditions. There were no airports, no telegraph lines, no telephone system. If you wanted to send a message from one end of the archipelago to the other, you put it on a boat and hoped it arrived eventually. And yet, despite all these limitations, there was genuine optimism at independence. For the first time in centuries, the Maldives was in complete control of its own destiny. No tribute payments, no foreign protectors, no compromises with imperial powers. Just a small island nation trying to figure out how to survive and maybe even thrive in the modern world. The independence period was remarkably peaceful compared to other decolonisation movements. There were no wars of independence, no guerrilla campaigns, no mass protests or violent crackdowns. The transition from protectorate to independent nation happened through negotiation and mutual agreement, which made the Maldives something of an outlier in the mid-20th century decolonisation process. But peaceful doesn't mean simple. The newly independent Maldives had to figure out what kind of country it wanted to be. Should it modernize rapidly or preserve traditional structures? How should it balance Islamic law with the demands of participating in the modern international system? What role should the Sultan play in a constitutional democracy? How could a nation of scattered coral islands with minimal resources build a functioning modern economy? These questions would come to a head pretty quickly, because within 3 years of independence, the Maldives would undergo another dramatic transformation, this time abolishing the Sultanate entirely and becoming a republic. The decision would reshape Maldivian politics, concentrate power in new hands, and set the stage for decades of authoritarian rule under leaders who would prove that independence from foreign powers doesn't automatically mean freedom for your own people. But that's a story for the next section. For now, let's pause at 1965, with the Maldives newly independent, still a sultanate, still deeply traditional, still trying to figure out its place in a rapidly changing world. The British are gone. The Portuguese are a distant memory, and for the first time in centuries, the Maldives answers to no one but itself. The question is what it's going to do with that freedom. Chapter 5: How to Modernize a Medieval Sultanate, with Mixed Results. 3 years after independence, the Maldives decided it was done with sultans. In November 1968, a referendum was held, and the people voted to abolish the Sultanate and establish a republic. Sultan Muhammad Farid Didi, who had ruled since 1954 and overseen the transition to independence, was deposed. He was the last sultan the Maldives would ever have. After over 800 years of sultanate rule, the country was going to try something different. The man who orchestrated this transition was Ibrahim Nasir, who had been Prime Minister and was now elected as the first president of what they called the Second Republic. Nasir was a modernizer with authoritarian tendencies, which is a combination that shows up depressingly often in post-colonial states. He believed the Maldives needed rapid development to survive in the modern world, and he was willing to concentrate power in his own hands to make that happen. Under Nasir, the Maldives began its first serious attempts at modernization: infrastructure projects, educational expansion, administrative reforms. These were good things, genuinely necessary things, and Nasir deserves credit for pushing them forward. But he also developed a reputation for corruption and authoritarian control that made him increasingly unpopular. By 1978, facing mounting criticism and political pressure, Nasir chose not to seek re-election. He left the Maldives and went into self-imposed exile in Singapore, where he lived until his death. His legacy remains contested, modernizer or autocrat, depending on who you ask and which aspects of his rule you're focusing on. But the thing that really transformed the Maldives during this period wasn't political reform or administrative changes, it was tourism, and it happened almost by accident. In 1972, a small resort called Kurumba opened on an island near Malé. It was aimed at European tourists, specifically Italians, who had been scouting the region for new beach destinations. The concept was simple: take a small uninhabited island, build some bungalows, bring in tourists who wanted pristine beaches and crystal clear water, and charge them money to experience a tropical paradise. The Maldives had exactly two things, beaches and water, so this actually made sense. The resort was successful, very successful, and almost immediately the Maldivian government and foreign investors realized they were sitting on a potential gold mine. The archipelago had over 1,000 islands. Most were uninhabited. The reefs were pristine. The water was absurdly clear. The marine life was spectacular. And European tourists, exhausted by cold winters and dreary weather, would apparently pay significant amounts of money to sit on a white sand beach and do absolutely nothing for a week. The government developed a policy that would define Maldivian tourism for the next 50 years. One island, one resort. Each resort would occupy an entire island, isolated from local population centres. This served multiple purposes. It kept tourists away from inhabited islands, which preserved traditional Maldivian culture and Islamic values. It prevented the kind of cultural contamination and social disruption that mass tourism had caused in other developing countries, and it allowed the government to carefully control and tax the industry. The tourism boom was extraordinary. By the 1980s, dozens of resort islands were operating. By the 1990s, it was over 100. The industry brought in foreign currency, created jobs, and completely reshaped the Maldivian economy. In the 1970s, fishing had accounted for roughly 90% of economic activity. By the 2000s, tourism was contributing nearly 30% of GDP, while fishing had declined to around 5%. The Maldives had transformed from a subsistence fishing economy to a service economy in barely a generation. For young Maldivians, this created entirely new career paths. Instead of following your father onto a fishing boat, you could train to work in hospitality, learn English, become a dive instructor, a chef, a resort manager. The best jobs paid well by local standards and offered exposure to the wider world, but they also required you to leave your home island, often for months at a time, to work at resorts where you'd serve wealthy foreigners who were paying more for a week's vacation than you'd earn in several months. The cultural impact was complex. Resort islands operated as separate spaces, deliberately isolated from traditional Maldivian society. Alcohol was served there, bikinis were worn, couples sunbathed together, all things that would be completely unacceptable on inhabited islands where Islamic law governed social norms. This compartmentalization worked, mostly. Tourists got their paradise experience without cultural friction, and Maldivian society maintained its religious conservatism without direct confrontation with Western tourist behavior. But it created a strange dual reality where the country's economic engine operated according to completely different rules than the society it was supporting. But this transformation created significant problems. The wealth from tourism was distributed extremely unevenly. Resort workers, many of them brought in from inhabited islands, earned relatively good wages. But the profits flowed to resort owners and the government, not to the broader population. The outer atolls, where most Maldivians still lived, saw minimal benefit. Malé became increasingly wealthy and overcrowded, while life on distant islands remained largely unchanged. The gap between the capital and the rest of the country widened dramatically. There was also the fundamental irony that the Maldives was becoming wealthy by selling an experience untouched tropical paradise that was being slowly destroyed by the very industry creating that wealth. Tourism is carbon intensive. Flying tourists from Europe and Asia to the Maldives, running air-conditioned resorts, operating speedboats and seaplanes, all of this contributed to the climate change that was causing the ocean levels to rise and the coral reefs to bleach. The Maldives was essentially selling its own destruction, slowly, at premium prices. While the economy was transforming, the political system remained stubbornly authoritarian. In 1978, Maumoon Abdul Gayoom was elected president. He would remain in power for the next 30 years, 3 decades, 6 consecutive terms. And for most of that period, the elections weren't really elections. They were referendums where people voted yes or no on whether Gayoom should continue as president. There were no opposition candidates, no political parties, no real choice. Gayoom's rule was authoritarian, but it was also relatively stable and focused on development. Under his presidency, the Maldives saw significant improvements in infrastructure. Airports were built on multiple atolls, making inter-island travel faster and more reliable. Ports were improved. Schools and hospitals were constructed on outer islands, bringing education and healthcare to populations that had previously had almost no access to either. Electricity reached more islands. Communications improved dramatically with the introduction of radio, then television, then telephone service, then eventually mobile phones and internet. Literacy rates climbed, life expectancy increased, infant mortality dropped. By many metrics, the Maldives was developing successfully. The GDP per capita grew substantially. The country transitioned from one of the poorest nations in the region to a middle-income country with relatively good development indicators. And Gayoom, whatever his authoritarian tendencies, could legitimately claim credit for much of this progress. He also made the Maldives a prominent voice on climate change, which was both strategically smart and desperately necessary. Starting in the 1980s, Gayoom began using international platforms to highlight the existential threat that rising sea levels pose to low-lying island nations. He spoke at the United Nations. He led advocacy efforts among small island developing states. He made sure the world knew that the Maldives wasn't just some tourist destination. It was a country facing potential extinction. The message was powerful precisely because it was true. The Maldives, with its average elevation of 1.5 meters, was one of the most vulnerable countries on Earth to climate change. A rise of even a meter or two in sea level would render most of the islands uninhabitable. Storm surges would become catastrophic. Fresh water supplies would be contaminated by saltwater intrusion. The reefs would die, removing the natural barriers that protected the islands from wave action. For the Maldives, climate change wasn't an abstract environmental issue, it was an existential crisis. The irony, of course, was that the country's economy depended almost entirely on an industry that contributed to the problem. Every tourist who flew to the Maldives added carbon to the atmosphere. Every resort powered by diesel generators contributed to warming. The nation was simultaneously the victim and, in a small way, a perpetrator. It's a contradiction that has never been resolved and probably can't be. But while Gayoom was building infrastructure and speaking eloquently about climate change on the world stage, he was also running an increasingly repressive political system. Dissidents were jailed, press freedom was severely restricted. Political opponents were exiled or intimidated into silence. Human rights organizations documented cases of torture and arbitrary detention. The Maldives was developing economically, but it was stagnating politically. In 1988, the regime faced its most serious threat. In November of that year, a group of Tamil mercenaries from Sri Lanka, backed by a Maldivian businessman named Abdullah Luthufi, who had his own grievances against Gayoom, attempted a coup. They landed in Malé, armed and organized, and briefly took control of key government buildings. Gayoom and some of his officials barely escaped. Gayoom immediately called India for help, and this is where you see the geopolitical realities of small island states very clearly. Within hours, the Indian military launched Operation Cactus, airlifting over 1,000 paratroopers to the Maldives. The Indian forces retook Malé, defeated the mercenaries, and restored Gayoom to power. Some of the coup plotters tried to escape by boat, but were intercepted by the Indian Navy. The coup attempt demonstrated two things. First, that the Maldives was extremely vulnerable to even small-scale military action. A few dozen armed men had briefly taken control of the capital. Second, that the Maldives' survival depended on maintaining good relations with India, which was the only power in the region capable of providing rapid military assistance. The Maldives was independent, but it was independence with an asterisk. If threatened, it needed India. And India, viewing the Maldives as part of its sphere of influence, was willing to intervene to protect a friendly government. After the failed coup, Gayoom's grip on power tightened further. Security forces were strengthened, surveillance increased. The regime became more paranoid and more repressive. But externally, the Maldives continued to project an image of tropical serenity. Tourists kept coming. Resorts kept opening. The economy kept growing. On the surface, everything looked fine. Beneath that surface, pressure was building. By the early 2000s, a new generation of Maldivians was coming of age. They had access to education, to the internet, to information about how other countries were governed. They could see the growing wealth disparity. They could see the concentration of power in Gayoom's hands. And they were increasingly unwilling to accept the old authoritarian bargain of economic development in exchange for political freedom. In 2003 and 2004, protests began. They were sparked partly by a death in custody, a young man who died while in police detention under suspicious circumstances. But the underlying causes went much deeper. People wanted accountability. They wanted the rule of law. They wanted political parties, free elections, and the ability to choose their own leaders without having them pre-selected. Gayoom, reading the political winds and perhaps sensing that the old system was unsustainable, began making concessions. In 2005, he announced that political parties would be allowed. It was a significant shift after decades of one-party rule. Opposition groups quickly organised. A man named Mohammed Nasheed, who had been repeatedly jailed for his activism, emerged as the leader of the opposition Maldivian Democratic Party. In 2008, a new constitution was adopted, establishing a multi-party presidential system with genuine competitive elections. For the first time in Maldivian history, citizens would be able to choose between actual candidates, not just vote yes or no on whether the incumbent should continue. The election that followed was historic. Nasheed defeated Gayoom in a runoff, ending 3 decades of rule. It was peaceful, it was democratic, and it suggested that the Maldives might finally be transitioning from authoritarian development state to genuine democracy. That optimism would prove premature, because while the Maldives had successfully modernized its economy and infrastructure, the political transformation was going to be far more complicated, far more turbulent, and far more contentious than anyone expected. Chapter 6. Paradise Interrupted. Mohammed Nasheed's presidency started with genuine hope and ended in chaos. When he took office in 2008 as the Maldives' first democratically elected president, he seemed like exactly the kind of leader a small island nation facing existential climate threats needed. He was young, charismatic, internationally connected, and genuinely committed to both democratic reform and climate action. He promised to transform the Maldives into a modern democracy while simultaneously saving it from drowning. In 2009, Nasheed pulled off one of the most brilliant pieces of climate activism ever conceived. He held a cabinet meeting underwater. The entire cabinet donned scuba gear, descended to the ocean floor, and conducted an official government meeting with waterproof hand signals and slates. It was pure political theatre, but it was effective theatre. The images went global. The message was impossible to miss. This is what happens when your country is drowning and nobody's listening. But domestic politics proved far more difficult than international climate advocacy. Nasheed tried to implement anti-corruption measures, which immediately made him enemies among the business elite who had profited from decades of patronage politics. He tried to reform the judiciary, which made him enemies among the judges. He tried to assert civilian control over the police and military, which made him enemies in the security forces. Within a few years, he'd managed to alienate almost every power centre in Maldivian society except his own supporters. In February 2012, everything collapsed. Police and military units mutinied. There were protests in Malé, and under circumstances that remained deeply contested, Nasheed resigned. He claimed it was a coup, that he was forced out at gunpoint. The government that replaced him claimed he resigned voluntarily. International observers were divided. What's clear is that after less than 4 years, the Maldives' first democratic president was out of office, and the country's fragile democratic experiment looked like it might be over. Nasheed's vice president, Muhammad Wahid, took over and immediately faced accusations of being a coup participant. The political situation descended into chaos. Protests, counter-protests, arrests. Nasheed was detained multiple times on various charges. The democracy that had seemed so promising in 2008 was unraveling in real time. Then, in 2013, in an ironic twist that would be funny if it weren't so depressing, Abdullah Yamin won the presidency. Yamin was Gayoom's half-brother, the same Gayoom who had ruled for 30 years, the same Gayoom who had finally been defeated in 2008, supposedly ending the era of authoritarian rule. Apparently, the Maldives had decided that what it really needed was authoritarian rule again, just under a different branch of the same family. Yamin's presidency was a masterclass in democratic backsliding. Opponents were jailed on dubious terrorism charges. Nasheed was imprisoned. Supreme Court judges who ruled against the government were arrested. Media outlets were shut down or intimidated into compliance. A state of emergency was declared. The brief democratic opening of 2008 to 2012 was systematically dismantled. But Yamin also did something that would have significant long-term consequences. He pivoted toward China. The Maldives had historically maintained close ties with India, which made sense given geographic proximity and India's status as the regional power. But Yamin courted Chinese investment aggressively. Chinese companies built a bridge connecting Malé to the airport island. They funded infrastructure projects across the archipelago. They loaned the Maldives hundreds of millions of dollars. This made some Maldivians very wealthy through corruption and kickbacks. It also made the country potentially vulnerable to debt-trap diplomacy, where nations that can't repay Chinese loans end up ceding strategic assets or political leverage. The Maldives, with its strategic position in the Indian Ocean, was exactly the kind of place where great power competition could play out in ways that wouldn't benefit the local population. In 2018, Maldivian voters finally had enough. In an election that Yamin clearly expected to win because authoritarian leaders always do, he lost to Ibrahim Mohamed Solih, a veteran politician backed by a broad democratic coalition. It was a remarkable victory for Maldivian democracy, proof that even after years of repression, people still wanted genuine representation. Yamin was later jailed for corruption, which felt like justice delayed but not entirely denied. Solih's presidency brought some stability. Democratic institutions were partially restored, anti-corruption efforts resumed. The worst excesses of the Yamin era were rolled back, but the underlying problems remained. The political culture was still personality-driven and polarized. Corruption was still endemic. Institutions were still weak. And then COVID-19 arrived and almost destroyed the economy. When the pandemic hit in 2020, global tourism collapsed overnight. Flights stopped, resorts closed, and the Maldives, which had built its entire modern economy around flying wealthy foreigners to tropical islands, suddenly had no revenue. The GDP contracted by over 30% in a single year. It was the worst economic crisis in modern Maldivian history, and it exposed just how vulnerable the country was to external shocks. The tourism industry eventually recovered as travel restrictions eased, but the crisis had demonstrated an uncomfortable truth: an economy based almost entirely on one industry. Luxury tourism dependent on long-haul flights is fragile. Diversification is necessary. But what else can a country of coral atolls with no resources, no agriculture, and no manufacturing base actually do? It's not a question with obvious answers. In 2023, Muhammad won the presidency on a nationalist platform that included an India Out campaign, pushing back against Indian military presence and influence. It was a significant shift after decades of close India-Maldives relations. Muidzu leaned toward China, raising concerns in New Delhi and Washington about geopolitical realignment in a strategically important part of the Indian Ocean. For the Maldives, being caught between India and China is an increasingly uncomfortable position. Both powers want influence, both offer infrastructure investment, both have strategic interests in the region, and the Maldives, tiny and vulnerable, has to navigate between them without getting crushed by either. It's a familiar position for small states in contested regions, but that doesn't make it any less precarious. Meanwhile, the climate crisis that Nasheed highlighted with his underwater cabinet meeting continues to accelerate. Sea levels are rising measurably. The Maldives has documented an average rise of 3 to 4 millimeters per year, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that the entire country averages 1.5 meters in elevation. At current projections, significant portions of the inhabited islands could be regularly flooded by mid-century. By the end of the century, many islands could be completely uninhabitable. The coral reefs, which are both a tourist attraction and a crucial natural barrier protecting islands from wave action, are dying. Bleaching events in 2016 and 2020 damaged huge sections of reef. Warmer water temperatures, ocean acidification, and pollution are preventing recovery. Without healthy reefs, the islands are far more vulnerable to storms and erosion. The government has tried various adaptation strategies. Malé has been surrounded by a massive seawall that looks like something from a disaster movie. Artificial islands like Hulhumalé have been built higher than natural islands, using sand dredged from the ocean floor. Some islands have had sand pumped onto beaches to combat erosion, but these are expensive temporary measures. They buy time. They don't solve the problem. The fundamental question facing the Maldives is whether adaptation is even possible long term, or whether the country will eventually need to consider the unthinkable. Evacuation. Some Maldivian leaders have discussed purchasing land abroad as insurance. Australia, Sri Lanka, and India have been mentioned as potential destinations. The idea of becoming climate refugees, of abandoning the islands that have been home for over 2,000 years, is devastating. But it might also be realistic. There are other challenges beyond climate and geopolitics. Islamic extremism, while not widespread, has appeared in the Maldives in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. A small number of young Maldivians travelled to Syria to join ISIS. Conservative religious movements have gained influence, creating tension with the tourism industry that depends on Western visitors expecting bikinis and alcohol. The compartmentalization that worked for decades resorts as separate spaces with different rules is being questioned by both religious conservatives and by those who see the hypocrisy in the arrangement. Drug abuse, particularly in Malé, where overcrowding and limited opportunities create social stress, has become a significant problem. Youth unemployment remains high. Gender inequality persists despite some progress. The gap between Malé and the outer atolls continues to widen, with the capital getting wealthier and more developed while many distant islands still lack basic services. Infrastructure has improved dramatically over the past decades. Bridges now connect some islands that were previously only accessible by boat. Multiple atolls have airports, making domestic travel faster. Malé and its surrounding islands are being developed into a greater Malé region through land reclamation and connectivity projects. But development remains uneven, and the outer atolls often feel abandoned by a government focused on the capital region and the most profitable tourist areas. Politically, democracy in the Maldives feels fragile. The country has now experienced cycles of democratic openings followed by authoritarian rollbacks. Institutions remain weak. The judiciary's independence is questionable. Press freedom is under constant pressure. Corruption continues to be endemic. Elections happen, but the political culture is dominated by personalities and patronage rather than policy and principle. And yet, for all these problems, the Maldives survives. Tourists still come over 1.5 million annually pre-COVID, and the numbers are recovering. The resorts still operate. The economy still functions. Daily life continues for most Maldivians much as it has for years, with fishing and tourism jobs, with prayers at the mosque, with children going to school, with families gathering. The Maldives remains one of the most beautiful places on earth. The water really is that blue. The beaches really are that white. The marine life really is that abundant. And the people, despite everything they've endured and everything they face, continue to build lives on these improbable coral islands. But the future is deeply uncertain. Will democracy survive? Will the political system stabilize? Or will the country continue cycling between democratic experiments and authoritarian leaders? Can the economy diversify enough to reduce dependence on tourism? Will the delicate balance between Islamic conservatism and tourism-dependent openness hold, or will it eventually fracture? And underlying everything, the question that can't be avoided, will the islands themselves survive? Climate change is not hypothetical for the Maldives. It's not something that might happen in the distant future. It's happening now, measurably, inexorably. The ocean is rising, the reefs are dying, the storms are intensifying, and there's no higher ground to retreat to. The Maldives has survived for over 2,000 years on these coral islands. It has survived isolation, poverty, colonial powers, coups, and authoritarian rule. It has adapted to Buddhism, then Islam, then tourism, then democracy. It has transformed from a subsistence fishing economy to a middle-income service economy. It has given the world a voice on climate change and shown what island resilience can look like. But resilience has limits, and the Maldives is approaching those limits in ways that engineering and adaptation and political will might not be enough to overcome. The next few decades will determine whether this nation of coral islands, this improbable paradise built on volcanic tombstones barely above the waves, can survive in a warming world. For now, the sun still rises over the Indian Ocean. The fishermen still head out at dawn. The tourists still arrive to float in crystal clear water. The calls to prayer still echo across the lagoons. And the Maldives continues to exist in that narrow space between the ocean and the sky, beautiful and vulnerable and defiant, refusing to disappear even as the water rises around it. That's the Maldives, that's the whole sweep of it. From ancient mariners landing on coral atolls to Buddhist kingdoms to Islamic sultanates to colonial protectorates to independent republics to tourist paradises to climate refugees in waiting. It's a history of adaptation, survival, and the stubborn human insistence that if you've built a civilization on a coral island once, You're not going to let something as inconvenient as the ocean take it away without a fight. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. And I hope, wherever you are right now, that you're comfortable and drifting off peacefully. I'll be back soon with another country. Until then, take care of yourselves. Good night.